The council chamber was already in session when I walked in late, not fashionably late, not strategically late, late because the docking port on the 7th ring had a gas leak, and the Keth attendant who was supposed to escort me decided that explaining the history of the leak in real time was more important than getting me to my seat before the opening vote. I had been awake for 31 hours. My dress uniform had a wrinkle across the left shoulder that I had tried to iron out with my palm 3 times on the shuttle ride over. It was still there. I could feel it like a small insult every time I moved. My name is Dara Vasquez. I am 38 years old. I was born in a coastal city that no longer exists on a planet that almost did not survive long enough to be called civilized. I hold a level 7 diplomatic clearance, 2 master's degrees in interstellar law and xenolinguistics, and a handwritten note in my jacket pocket from Ambassador Claire Odom that said, in her careful and very deliberate handwriting, "Do not do the thing." I knew what the thing was. I had always known. The Grand Convocation Chamber of the Interstellar Council was enormous. Not enormous the way a stadium is enormous, where the scale feels exciting and communal. Enormous the way a geological formation is enormous. Cold, indifferent, shaped over millions of years without any particular concern for the people standing inside it. The ceiling was a dome of translucent blue stone that filtered the light of whatever star this station orbited into something pale and gray. The seats were arranged in concentric arcs, 12 sections for 12 species, each section color-coded and marked with symbols that had been designed 800 years ago, when the council was founded, and had not changed, since because no one had ever felt the need to change them. The 13th section was new. It was smaller than the others. It had been installed 6 months ago, quickly, without much ceremony, after 40 years of debate about whether humans were ready. The seats were a slightly different shade than the rest of the chamber. They did not quite match. I noticed this immediately. There was one seat in that section, mine. I walked to it without making eye contact with anyone, settled in, placed my briefing tablet on the surface in front of me, and smiled. I had been trained to smile, not a wide, enthusiastic smile that read as aggressive to 3 of the 12 species present, not a small, tight smile that read as consenting to 4 others, a middle smile, a careful, neutral, professionally warm smile that communicated nothing threatening and nothing weak. I had practiced it in the mirror for 6 months before this posting. I had been practicing it in mirrors, in windows, in the reflective surfaces of shuttle walls for the entire flight here, 31 hours. The smile was now automatic. It happened independently of whatever I was actually feeling, which at that moment was a combination of exhaustion, hunger, and a very specific kind of quiet anger that I had learned, over years of diplomatic training, to keep in a room at the back of my mind with the door shut. The session had already opened. The presiding counselor, a tall, thin being called Elder Voss of the Leithani, was speaking in the slow, rhythmic cadence that the Leithani used for formal address. I pulled up the live translation feed on my tablet. Elder Voss was welcoming the convocation, standard opening remarks. I had read the script beforehand. Nothing new. What was new was the figure standing at the secondary podium. Counselor Thrix of the Veth hegemony was one of the most recognized faces in interstellar diplomacy, not because people liked him, because he was very, very good at making decisions that affected other people, look like they were doing those people a favor. He was tall for a Veth, which meant he was about the same height as a human of average build, with the long facial ridges that marked senior Veth, officials, and eyes that were a pale, almost colorless silver. He wore robes in the deep blue of the hegemony, layered and formal, and he stood at the podium with a particular kind of stillness that only came from decades of practice, at looking more patient than everyone else. In the room he was already speaking. I caught the tail end of what he was saying as I synced my translation feed. And we are, of course, deeply pleased to formalize the inclusion of the human delegation in this body. Their journey has been a long one, and the council has watched with great interest. With great care he paused, and his pale eyes moved to my section of the chamber, to my seat, to me. He smiled, and his smile was very different from mine. Great care, he repeated. For a civilization that is still, in many meaningful ways, finding its footing. The chamber made a sound that was not quite applause and not quite agreement, but somewhere between the two. I recognized it. It was the sound of a room full of very important beings politely endorsing something that had just been said. I wrote in my notes, in the small, careful handwriting I used when I did not want anyone reading over my shoulder, finding its footing. Then I wrote underneath it, "We have been walking for 10,000 years. Then I looked up and kept smiling. Ambassador Claire Odom had briefed me 3 times before departure. Once in her office, once over a secure comm channel from the orbital station, and once on a recorded message I could only play twice before it deleted itself, which told me everything about how seriously she was taking this. Posting the brief was always the same. Humanity had finally been granted a seat, a real seat. Not observer status, not advisory capacity, not the polite fiction of consultative member. A full seat with a vote in the Interstellar Council. It had taken 40 years of careful, measured, relentlessly patient diplomacy to get here, and the single most important thing I could do was not ruin it. You are not there to argue. Ambassador Odom had told me, in the tone of someone who had needed to say this more than once in her life. You are not there to correct anyone. You are not there to prove anything. You are there to listen, to nod, to speak only when spoken to, and to file objections through proper written channels after the session. And if they do something that directly violates treaty law, I had asked. She had looked at me for a long time. File it in writing, and if they do it in real time in front of the entire chamber. File it, she said. In writing. I had looked at the note she pressed into my hand as I boarded the shuttle. Do not do the thing. I had folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. It was still there. I could feel it against my ribs when I breathed. Counselor Thrix finished his remarks and returned to his seat. The chamber moved on to procedural items. I followed along on my tablet, cross-referencing with the briefing documents I had memorized on the flight over. The items were routine, scheduling, resource allocation reviews, a border survey report from the Keth Outer Systems, and then, 40 minutes into the session, a new item appeared on the agenda. It had not been in the pre-session documents I had received. I checked twice 3 times, scrolling back through the briefing package. It was not there. It had been added after I boarded the shuttle. The item was called the Meridian Framework Proposal. I opened it. I began to read. By the time I finished the first subsection, the quiet room at the back of my mind, the one where I kept everything I was not supposed to say, was very full and the door was straining against the frame. I kept reading. I kept my face still. I kept my smile exactly where it was supposed to be. And in my notes, in letters slightly larger than I usually wrote, I typed, "They are not serious then." After a pause, I deleted it and wrote instead, "They are very serious." Then I wrote, "Be careful, Dara." I was being very careful. I was being the most careful I had ever been in my life, which was saying something, because I had grown up on the coast of a city that no longer existed, and careful had been a survival skill long before it became a professional one. Elder Voss announced that the Meridian Framework Proposal would be formally introduced in the following session, 2 days from now. He invited all delegations to review the document and prepare their positions. I saved the document. I flagged it. I cross-referenced it against 17 other treaty documents I had stored on my tablet. Then I looked up at the chamber, at the 12 sections full of beings who had been doing this for centuries, at the one section that was slightly the wrong color, and held only one person, and I breathed carefully. The session ended an hour later. The Keth attendant, a different one this time, thankfully not the one who explained gas leaks, walked me back to the human quarters, a small suite near the outer ring that smelled faintly of recycled air, and someone else's idea of what humans preferred. The bed was the wrong firmness. The light settings defaulted to cool blue, which was apparently what they thought was calming. I changed it to warm. I sat on the edge of the bed. I pulled out Ambassador Odom's note. I read it again. Do not do the thing. I put it back in my pocket. Then I opened the Meridian Framework Proposal again, made myself a cup of something that was not quite coffee but had caffeine in it, and began to read every single word from the beginning. I would read it all night if I had to. I would read every line, every clause, every footnote and reference and attached addendum. I would know it better than the people who had written it. I would know exactly what it said and exactly what it did not say, and exactly what it was trying to do while pretending to say something else. Entirely, I had not come 40 light years to file things in writing. Well, not only to file things in writing. I set down my cup and started from page 1. The thing about being a diplomat is that nobody talks about the silences. They talk about the speeches, the handshakes, the signed documents, and the ceremonial meals, and the carefully worded communiques that get released to the press afterward. They talk about breakthroughs and agreements and historic moments. What they do not talk about is the hours you spend sitting in rooms where everyone is saying something they do not mean, while meaning something they are not saying, and your entire job is to hold both versions of reality in your head at once and not let your face show which one you actually believe. I had been doing this for 11 years. I was good at it. I was, according to my last 3 performance reviews, exceptionally good at it. My supervisor at the Earth Diplomatic Corps had once described my emotional control as almost unsettling. I had taken that as a compliment. The morning of the second day, I woke up at 4 a.m. station time, having slept for exactly 3 hours and 40 minutes. The Meridian Framework Proposal was open on my tablet. I had read it 6 times. I had cross-referenced it against 22 treaty documents. 4 historical precedents, and a legal commentary published by the Lethani Institute of Interspecies Law that was 1100 years old and still, it turned out directly relevant. I knew what the Meridian Framework proposal was. I knew what it was actually doing underneath the language it used to describe what it was doing. And I knew, with the calm certainty that comes from a night spent reading very carefully, that it was one of the most quietly aggressive pieces of legislation I had ever seen. Not aggressive in any way that would look aggressive from the outside. It was smooth. It was polished. It used phrases like mutual benefit and collaborative resource stewardship and the long-term interests of all developing civilizations. It was, in the language of diplomacy, beautifully written. What it did buried in subsection 7, paragraph B, clause 2, in language that required 3 cross-references to other documents to fully parse, was remove humanity from 3 resource corridors in the outer meridian zone that we had been developing for 15 years. Not explicitly. The proposal never mentioned humanity by name in that subsection. It described a category of member species, newly admitted, under 60 years of full council participation, with a species maturity index below a certain threshold, and established that such species would be subject to guided resource stewardship during a transitional period, meaning their corridor access would be managed by a council committee rather than by their own government. That committee would be chaired by the Veth hegemony. I read that part 4 times. Then I looked at the ceiling of my room for a while. It was still the wrong shade of blue. Then I sent a priority message to Ambassador Odom. Her reply came back in 40 minutes, which told me she was awake, which told me she had already seen the document, which told me she had been waiting for my message. The reply was 3 sentences. I have reviewed the proposal. Note your objection formally in the session record. Do not escalate. I stared at those 3 sentences for a long time, then I wrote back. The proposal directly contradicts Article 14 of the Galactic Compact. It also conflicts with the resource access guarantee established in the Solon Accords of Year 340. These are not minor procedural overlaps. Her reply came in 7 minutes this time. I now note the objection. File it through proper channels. After the session, I set down the tablet. I got up, I walked to the window. Outside was space. Which is to say, outside was the particular kind of darkness that makes every other kind of darkness feel less serious. There were stars. There were other ships docked at the outer ring, their running lights moving slowly in the rotation of the station. There was a Veth diplomatic cruiser at the far end of the dock, much larger than the shuttle I had arrived on. It was painted in the hegemony's deep blue. I thought about the 15 years we had spent developing the Meridian corridors. I thought about the survey teams, the early missions, the 3 stations we had built that were now fully operational and running. I thought about the people who had spent their careers doing that work, who had signed up for postings in the outer systems because humanity had been promised, in clear treaty language, that the corridors would remain under Earth authority. I thought about the phrase guided resource, stewardship, and what it meant for those people. Then I thought about something else. I thought about the 40 years before I was born. The 40 years during which humanity had been knocking on the door of this council, hat in hand, patient and polite and endlessly reasonable, while species that had been traveling the stars for centuries looked down with the particular kind of warmth that adults use when they find a child's persistence charming rather than convincing. I had grown up hearing about those 40 years. My mother's generation remembered the first contact period. My grandmother's generation had lived through the first decade of observer status, when Earth delegations were allowed to sit in the chamber, but not vote, allowed to speak only when addressed, allowed to express opinions that were then thanked for and set aside. I had read the transcripts of those early sessions. The language used to describe humanity was always kind, always warm, always exactly the same kind of warm that Counselor Thrix had used yesterday, when he called us a civilization still finding its footing. 40 years of that. 40 years of being told, not yet, not quite, almost but not quite enough. And each time humanity had pushed back even slightly, someone had pulled out the species maturity index, a metric developed by the council itself, measured by the council itself, reviewed by the council itself, and pointed out with great regret that humanity was still 0. 3 points below the threshold required for full consideration. Always 0.3 points, always exactly 0.3 points, for 20 years running. The second session began at 9 in the morning station time. I was in my seat 15 minutes early. I had my tablet, I had my notes. I had my cross-references, my citations, my carefully organized objections, and my professionally warm smile. I also had a message from my colleague Peter Okafor, back at the Earth Diplomatic Office on the station, who had reviewed my analysis of the Meridian proposal overnight and sent me a message that said, "You're right about all of it. For what it's worth, It was worth something, not much in practical terms, but something. The session opened. Elder Voss presided as before. The first 2 hours were administrative, trade agreements, a dispute between the Keth and a smaller species called the Mirren about navigational boundaries in a shared system. I followed along, took notes, filed the relevant observations in the session record as required. Then, at 11:40, Elder Voss announced that the formal introduction of the Meridian Framework proposal would now proceed. Councillor Thrix rose from his seat and walked to the primary podium. He spoke for 22 minutes. I timed it. His speech was elegant. It was the kind of speech that sounds like it is about one thing while actually being about another. In this case, it sounded like it was about collaborative growth and interspecies partnership, and the responsible stewardship of shared resources, while actually being about the Veth hegemony, acquiring administrative control over 3 resource corridors that did not belong to them. But it was beautifully phrased. Every sentence was technically accurate, in the way that carefully selected truths can be accurate without being honest. He cited precedents, he cited development metrics, he cited the long history of the Council's support for newer member species. He said the word partnership 11 times, I counted. He did not mention humanity specifically. He did not need to. The framework did all the work for him. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the sound came again. That sound that was not quite applause and not quite agreement. The murmur of a room that had already made up its mind. I looked at the other sections of the chamber. The Keth delegation was nodding. The Mirren representative looked uncertain but said nothing. The Lethani elder, Elder Voss himself, was expressionless, which was difficult to read. And in the 13th section, smaller than the rest, slightly the wrong color, I sat and breathed carefully and looked at the note I had received from Ambassador Odom 3 hours ago. Do not escalate. I thought about the people in the Meridian corridors. I thought about the treaty language. I thought about the 1100-year-old legal commentary I had found at 4 in the morning. I thought about Article 14. I thought about the Solon Accords. Then Elder Voss said in his slow, formal cadence that the proposal would be open for member response. Several councillors spoke. Most were in favor. One, representing a species called the Tharvan, expressed mild concern about the timeline and asked for an extension on the review period. Councillor Thrix said he appreciated the Tharvan's diligence and suggested a 48-hour extension, which the chamber accepted. Then Elder Voss said, the human delegation may offer acknowledgement if they wish. Acknowledgement, not response, not objection, acknowledgement. I stood up. My notes were open on my tablet. My prepared text was right there, 3 sentences long. Humanity respectfully notes this proposal and looks forward to participating in further dialogue as the process develops. Thank you, Elder Voss. Thank you, Council. 3 sentences. That was all I was supposed to say. I looked at my prepared text. I looked at Councillor Thrix, who was watching me from his seat with those pale silver eyes and a very small smile that said, as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud, that he expected exactly 3 sentences. No more, nothing more. I looked at the chamber, 12 sections, 800 years old, and in my section, my one seat, my slightly wrong color. Then I looked back at my tablet, and something very specific happened, which was that I turned to a different page. Elder Voss, I said. With respect, I would like to do more than acknowledge the room changed. It was not a dramatic change. No one gasped, no one stood up. It was just a subtle shift in the quality of the attention in the room, the way a room changes when everyone in it simultaneously becomes more alert. Elder Voss looked at me for a long moment. The human delegate may proceed, he said slowly, in a way that left room for me to reconsider. I did not reconsider. The Meridian Framework proposal, I said, as presented in its current form, conflicts with existing council law in at least 3 specific and documented ways. I would like to address each one. Councillor Thrix's small smile did not move, but something behind his pale eyes shifted very slightly. I opened my first citation. Article 14 of the Galactic Compact, I said, and I kept my voice level and clear, not raised, not aggressive, just the voice I used when I was explaining something that mattered and wanted to make sure it was understood. Establishes the right of all full member species to direct administrative authority over any resource development project they have initiated, staffed, and maintained for a continuous period of 10 years or longer, without external management intervention except in cases of documented mismanagement which must be formally established through the review tribunal process. I paused. I let that sit. The Meridian corridors have been under Earth-initiated development for 15 years, I said. There has been no review tribunal. There has been no documented mismanagement finding. Under Article 14, the corridors are not eligible for external management reassignment without those prerequisites. The Meridian Framework proposal as written would create that reassignment without meeting those prerequisites. The silence in the chamber was a different kind of silence now. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that happens when something unexpected has been said, and the room is deciding what to do with it. Counselor Thrix had set down his stylus. I noticed that. I will move to my second point, I said, and I did. I had not planned for this to go the way it was going. Or rather, I had planned for exactly this, in the sense that I had spent the entire night preparing for it, knowing that if it came to it, I would be ready. But I had also told myself, on the shuttle, in the docking port, in my room at 4 in the morning with my not quite coffee going cold beside me, that I would not do this, that I would file it in writing, that I would follow the process, that I would be patient, as I had always been patient, as humanity had always been patient. And then Elder Voss had said the human delegation may offer acknowledgement, and something had shifted. Some specific weight had redistributed itself, and I had looked at that word, acknowledgement, and I had thought about the 40 years, and I had thought about the corridors, and I had thought about the people who had built 3 functioning stations in deep space, because they had been told those stations were theirs to build, and I had decided very quietly, without drama, that acknowledgement was not what I was here to offer. The Solon Accords, I said, moving to my second citation, established in year 340, Article 8, Paragraph C, states specifically that delegated Vasquez. It was a voice from the Veth section, not Thrix, one of his junior council members, a Veth female whose name I had not yet learned, speaking across the chamber in a tone that was still polite but was also clearly a warning. Your time for acknowledgement. Elder Voss granted me the floor to proceed, I said, without looking at her, without raising my voice, without changing anything about the way I was standing. I am proceeding. A beat of silence. Delegate Vasquez may proceed, Elder Voss said, in a voice that gave nothing away. I turned back to my citation. And here is the thing about being exceptionally good at emotional control. People tend to assume it means you do not have emotions, that the stillness is a natural state, or a cultivated emptiness, or a kind of diplomatic numbness that comes from years of practice. They assume that when you are very calm, nothing is happening underneath the calm. What it actually means is that you have learned to run 2 things at once. On the outside, the voice, the posture, the carefully measured pace of speech, the level gaze and the professional tone. On the inside, something else entirely. On the inside, 11 years of observations and experiences and quiet frustrations that had been building pressure in a room with a very strong door. And the door was still closed and would remain closed, because that was what I did, that was who I was. That was the difference between doing what I was doing right now and doing the thing. What I was doing right now was citing law. Citing it precisely, citing it completely, citing it with the 47 references I had spent the night compiling, one by one in order, with dates and document numbers and the specific page and paragraph of every relevant source. What I was not doing was losing my composure. What I was not doing was raising my voice. What I was not doing was saying a single thing that could be dismissed as emotional or unprofessional, or what I was doing was making it impossible to ignore. Counselor Thrix has had his stylus again, but he was not writing. He was holding it the way people hold things when they need to hold something, and the thing they want to hold is not available. I reached my 5th citation, then my 6th. The chamber had stopped making any sound at all, not the murmur of agreement sound, not any sound. Just the particular silence of a room full of very experienced beings who were watching something they had not expected and had not prepared for, and were not entirely sure what to do with. My 7th point, I said, concerns the precedent established in the Veth-Keth Joint Development Agreement of year 412, which the Veth hegemony itself submitted to the council record as a model for Elder Voss. Counselor Thrix's voice was very controlled, almost as controlled as mine. I would note that the human delegate has exceeded her designated acknowledgement time considerably. Elder Voss looked at the time record. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Thrix. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in a room this quiet felt much longer. The delegate has the floor, Elder Voss said, until she is finished. I did not look at Thrix when he said that. I kept my eyes on my tablet. But I heard it, and something in me. Not the room at the back where I kept everything else, but something else. Something smaller and more human and less diplomatic, felt for just a moment a very specific and very precise kind of satisfaction. I said, "Thank you, Elder Voss," and I went back to my citations. By the time I reached number 32, the Keth delegate had stopped nodding. The Mirren representative was sitting forward in his seat, reading something on his own tablet. I suspected he had pulled up the same documents I was citing. 3 of the other delegations had gone quiet in a way that was different from the polite quiet of before. This was the quiet of people doing calculations. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I did not repeat myself. I moved through every point, every cross-reference, every legal conflict, in order, clearly, methodically, not angrily, not triumphantly, just completely. The way you do something, when you have been given one chance to do it, and you want it done right. When I finally said, and that concludes my formal response, my voice was exactly the same as when I had started, the same pace, the same level, the same professional and carefully maintained calm. The chamber was very quiet, and then, from the Lethani section, from Elder Voss's section, though not from Elder Voss himself but from his senior delegate, a being I had not yet heard speak, there came a sound, low, resonant, rhythmic. It took me a moment to identify it because I had never heard a Lethani make this sound before. I looked at my translation feed. The translation read, approval. Not the murmur of agreement sound, approval. The Lethani word for it was something like the ground holds, which in their language carried the weight of a very old thing being confirmed. Councillor Thrick said, in a voice that was still controlled but thinner than before. The council would note that this response, while extensive, raises procedural questions about the procedural questions it raises, Elder Voss said, speaking for the first time since he had given me the floor, are the questions that should have been raised before this proposal was introduced. The human delegate has identified them. They will be addressed. Another silence. I closed my tablet. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the surface in front of me and then, because I was alone in my section and no one was watching me specifically and the chamber had moved into a quietly agitated discussion that required everyone's attention in other directions, I allowed myself, very briefly, to close my eyes. My jaw hurt. I had not noticed until just now. I had been holding my expression in place for so long that the muscles had begun to protest. I relaxed them, slowly, carefully, the way you ease pressure off something that has been held tight for too long. Then I opened my eyes. I put my smile back where it was supposed to be. I picked up my tablet. My tablet had a message from Peter Okafor. It said, the corridor access question just went to legal review. I'm watching the internal feed. What did you do? I typed back. I cited some documents. He's how many? I sent 37 so far. I have more. He sent nothing for almost a minute. Then he sent, Ambassador Odom is going to have thoughts about this. I already knew that. I had known it before I stood up. I had known it in some part of myself, from the moment I sat down in my slightly wrong color seat and watched Councillor Thrix look at me with those pale eyes and that small, certain smile. But I also knew something else. I knew what I had read at 4 in the morning. I knew what the treaty language said. I knew what the Meridian corridors meant to the people who had built them. I knew what it meant to be told, 40 times in 40 years. Not yet, not quite, but not quite enough. And I knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had spent a night reading every word and a lifetime, learning how to hold things together under pressure, that I had not broken any rules. I had followed every rule, every procedure, every protocol. I had cited law. I had spoken when given the floor. I had remained professional and clear and composed throughout. I had simply declined to be small about it. The session adjourned at 4 in the afternoon. I walked back to my quarters alone, because the Keth attendant seemed uncertain about how to interact with me now, which I filed away as something to address later. I opened my door, went inside, sat on the edge of the bed that was the wrong firmness, and looked at the wall. Then I took out Ambassador Odom's note. Do not do the thing. I turned it over in my hands. Then I put it on the side table, went to the window and looked out at the stars, and the other ships, and the Veth diplomatic cruiser still parked at the end of the dock in its deep, certain blue. I thought about tomorrow. I had 12 more citations. The morning of the third day had a particular quality to it that I had only experienced a few times in my career. It was the quality of a situation that had changed shape overnight without anyone having done anything further, simply because everyone involved had gone away and thought about it and come back with different calculations than before. The message from Ambassador Odom arrived at 6:17 in the morning, station time. It was longer than her previous messages, which were usually short enough to qualify as directives. This one was 4 paragraphs, and it began, I have reviewed the session transcript. I read it standing by the window with my not quite coffee in hand. The second paragraph said, what you did was not what I instructed you to do. The third paragraph said, the legal review has been confirmed. The Meridian proposal is on hold pending an analysis of Article 14 and the Solon Accords. The Keth delegation has filed their own supporting citations. The Tharvan delegate has requested a full legal committee review. The fourth paragraph said, we will discuss this when you return. Carry on. I read that last line twice. Carry on. I put the tablet down. I looked at the window. I drank my not quite coffee. It was still not quite right, but this morning it tasted a little better. My calm went again at 7. It was Peter. You're becoming a situation, he said, which was his way of saying things were moving faster than expected. How much of a situation? I asked. The Mirren delegation sent a formal inquiry to council records this morning, he said. They want to know which precedents apply to their navigational boundary case with the Keth. Turns out some of what you cited yesterday applies to them too. They've been in observer status for 32 years, by the way. 32 years. Dara. I was quiet for a moment. I didn't cite anything that wasn't already there, I said. I know, he said. That's what's making people nervous. The session convened at 9. I was in my seat at 8:40. I had my tablet. I had my remaining 12 citations in order, in case they were needed. I had a new cup of the not-quite coffee that the room's dispenser made, which today I had added something to. A small packet of something sweet that I had found in the welcome kit in my room and had not yet tried. It turned out to be a reasonable improvement. I made a note to request more of them. Counselor Thrix was already in his seat when I arrived. He did not look in my direction. This was notable, because on the first 2 days he had made a point of looking in my direction when I entered, with that particular expression that translated as, "I see you there, and I know exactly what to do with you." Today he was looking at his tablet. I considered this, then I opened my own tablet and went back to my notes. Elder Voss called the session to order. The first item was not, as I had expected, a continuation of yesterday. The first item was an announcement. Elder Voss said in his slow and formal cadence that given the number of legal questions raised in the previous session, the Meridian Framework proposal had been referred to the Council's Legal Standards Committee for a full review under the Galactic Compact. A determination would be issued within 30 days. All existing resource access arrangements, Elder Voss added, remain in effect during the review period. I wrote in my notes, Article 14 holds, then I added very small at the bottom of the page, 15 years of corridor access secured. For now, the Lithani senior delegate, the one who had made the approval sound yesterday, looked across the chamber at me when Elder Voss finished speaking. They held my gaze for a long moment. Then they moved their head in a very slight, very deliberate motion that I recognized from my xanolinguistics training as the Lithani equivalent of a nod. I kept my face still, but I held their gaze and returned the motion as precisely as I could manage. The session moved on day schedules, a Keth infrastructure update, the Mirren boundary question, which was now scheduled for a formal hearing rather than a summary decision. I followed along, took my notes, filed my observations. At 11:30, during a recess, my comm buzzed with a message from an unknown source, an internal council address. I didn't recognize the message was very short. It said well read for a young delegation. It was unsigned. I checked the sender address. It was from the Lithani section of the council network. I held the tablet and read that message 3 times. Young delegation. We had been traveling the stars for 40 years. We had been building and working and asking to be seen as equals for 4 decades. And still, young delegation. But there was something different in the way the Lithani used that phrase compared to Thrix. I read it again. Well read for a young delegation. It was not dismissive. It was not condescending. It was something else. Something closer to the way an experienced person might say to someone who has just done something unexpected. I was wondering when you'd get there. I wrote a reply. I kept it short. I said, we've had a lot of time to read. I sent it back to the Lithani address. The reply came in 2 minutes. It said, yes, we noticed you were reading. We were waiting to see what you would do with it. I read that several times as well. Then I put the tablet face down on the surface in front of me and sat very still for a moment, looking at the pale gray light coming through the dome of blue stone above. They had been watching, not just today, not just yesterday, for longer than that, waiting to see what we would do with what we knew, whether we would file it in writing, or whether, eventually, one of us would stand up in a chamber 800 years old and say the thing that was true. I thought about my grandmother's generation. I thought about the observer status decades, the transcripts I had read as a student, the way humanity had come back, year after year, hat in hand, asking to be included. I thought about the person in this seat before me. There had been others, in the observer decades, who had sat in less formal versions of this same seat and watched and listened and said nothing, because nothing was what was permitted. I wondered if they had known those people. I wondered if they had read the same documents I had read, found the same legal foundations, understood the same conflicts and contradictions. I wondered if they had written their own versions of my notes, the ones I kept in small, careful handwriting that no one else was supposed to see. Finding its footing, we have been walking for 10,000 years. I thought about what Peter had said, 32 years. The Mirren delegation had been in observer status for 32 years, and something I had done yesterday, just by standing up and saying the things that were documented and true, had opened a door in their direction that had been quietly sealed for 3 decades. I had not planned for that. I had not known, when I turned to the wrong page on my tablet, that it would ripple outward. I had been thinking about the 15 years of corridor work and the people who had built 3 stations in deep space. I had been thinking about Article 14 and the Solon Accords. I had not been thinking about the Mirren, but they were thinking about me. The recess ended. I turned my tablet back over and went back to my notes. At 2 in the afternoon, Counselor Thrix requested to make a statement. Elder Voss granted it. Thrix walked to the podium. He looked different today, not less composed. He was too good for that. But there was something in the way he held himself that was fractionally more careful than before. He said that the Veth hegemony fully supported the legal review process. He said that the hegemony had always intended the Meridian framework as a collaborative tool, and that any clarifications required by the Legal Standards Committee would be welcomed. He said the word partnership 7 times, I counted. He did not look at me once during the entire statement. When he sat down, I wrote in my notes, 7 partnerships today. Yesterday was 11. Then I wrote progress. After the session, I called my mother. She was 63 years old. And she had grown up in the early years of observer status when humanity's place in the universe had felt like a question that was being asked but not answered. She had worked her whole life as an environmental engineer, rebuilding coastlines, and she had never gone to space. She watched the council broadcasts sometimes late at night, she told me, because she liked to see what was happening, even if she did not always understand the details. How was the second day, she asked. Which was what she asked every time I called, no matter what the context was. The third day, Mom, I said. It's been 3 days, how was it? I thought about how to answer that. I said some things yesterday, I said. Things I was probably supposed to save for a written report. She was quiet for a moment. Were they true? Yes. Were they important? Yes. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite satisfaction but something between the two, that I had known since I was small and had always understood to mean, that's my daughter. Did you get in trouble? She asked. Probably, I said. Ambassador Odom is going to have thoughts. Let her have them, my mother said. You're there, she's not. I smiled. It was the real kind. Not the practiced one. I had not used it much in the last 3 days. How are the corridors? She asked. She did not entirely understand the corridors. The technical details of resource development in the outer systems were not her area. But she had followed the development news because I had asked her to, and she knew they mattered to me. They're still ours, I said, for now. Good, she said. Keep them. After the call, I sat on the edge of the bed that was the wrong firmness and looked at the note from Ambassador Odom that I had left on. The side table, do not do the thing. I picked it up. I turned it over. On the back, which was blank, I wrote, in small, careful letters. I did the thing, then I folded it back up and put it in my jacket pocket next to where it had been before. Tomorrow was day 4. I had 12 citations. Left, I did not know if I would need them, but they were ready. Everything was ready. I turned off the light, the warm setting that I had changed from the blue on the first night, and lay back on the bed that was the wrong firmness, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Somewhere across the station, in a room that was the right shade of hegemony blue, Counselor Thrix was also in the dark, as assumed, also thinking about tomorrow. I hoped he had read Article 14. I hoped he had read all of it. The full text, the historical commentary, the precedents, the footnotes. I hoped he had read the 1100-year-old Lithani analysis that said, in language that was formal and ancient and completely unambiguous, that the compact meant exactly what it said. I was, by nature and by training, a person who gave others the benefit of the doubt. But I also had 12 more citations, and unlike the first 37, I had not mentioned these to anyone. I closed my eyes. The corridor access was secured. The legal review was running. The Mirren had filed an inquiry. The Lithani had sent a message that said, we were waiting to see what you would do with it. I thought I was beginning to understand what they meant. The Legal Standards Committee published its preliminary findings 11 days after the session, which was 19 days ahead of the 30-day schedule Elder Voss had announced. This was unusual. The committee had not moved ahead of schedule in over a century. Peter sent me the notification at 6 in the morning, station time, with no message attached, just the document flag which told me everything I needed to know about how he felt. I read the findings before I got up. The preliminary conclusion was 43 pages long. It confirmed that the Meridian Framework proposal, as drafted, conflicted with Article 14 of the Galactic Compact in 4 documented instances. I had cited 3. The committee had found a 4th I had missed, buried in a subsection about administrative continuity that I had read twice and not flagged. I noted that with genuine respect for whoever on the committee had found it. Good reading. The findings further confirmed the conflict with the Solon Accords, the Resource Access Guarantee, and 2 additional precedents that I had included in my later citations. The proposal, the committee said, would require substantial revision before it could be advanced to a vote. The final paragraph said, in the careful formal language of legal findings, that the Council was reminded of its obligation under the Compact to ensure that all member species, regardless of their date of admission, receive equal protection under existing treaty frameworks, and that no procedural mechanism, including the Species Maturity Index evaluation process, could be used to create de facto inequalities in member treatment without explicit compact amendment. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I put the tablet down and looked at the window. No procedural mechanism, including the Species Maturity Index. I had not cited the Species Maturity Index. I had not mentioned it in my 37 citations. It was not directly relevant to the Meridian proposal. It was a separate issue, a longer issue, the kind of issue that would take more than one session and more than one delegate to address. I had not touched it, but someone on the committee had. I picked up my tablet and sent a message to the Lethani address that had messaged me before. I said, "The preliminary findings mention the Species Maturity Index." The reply came in 4 minutes. It said, "Yes." I didn't raise that point. The reply said, "No, we did." I held the tablet for a long moment. The Species Maturity Index had been the mechanism that kept humanity at 0, 3 points below the threshold for 20 consecutive years. The instrument that had been used, always gently, always with expressions of great hope for humanity's continued development, to delay full participation, the measuring stick that was always slightly out of reach, and the Lethani, the oldest species on the council, the ones who had been here since the beginning, who had helped write the compact, who had watched quietly from their section of the chamber for centuries, had added it to the findings, without being asked. I thought about that. I thought about the message they had sent. We were waiting to see what you would do with it. They had been watching, not just waiting for humanity to cause trouble, or to embarrass ourselves, or to finally do the thing we had always been warned not to do, waiting for something specific. Waiting for the moment when one of us stood up in a chamber 800 years old, with no raised voice and no dramatic gesture, and simply said, "Here is what the document says, here is what it means, here is what you are doing that conflicts with it." Waiting for us to be, not louder, not angrier, not more aggressive, just more precise. I looked at the preliminary findings again, 43 pages. I read all of them. The session that day was a shorter one, procedural. The findings had been distributed to all delegations, and Elder Voss announced that formal response would be gathered over the following week before. A full session reconvened. There was a Keth infrastructure vote, and a minor trade matter between 2 of the older species that was resolved in under an hour. Nothing was asked of me except to be present and file my attendance in the record. I was present. I filed my attendance. At one point during the Keth vote, the senior Lethani delegate looked across the chamber at me. It was a long look, level and unhurried. I met it. Then they did the small deliberate motion again, the nod, and this time they followed it with something else, a very slight inclination of their head, different from the nod. I checked my xenolinguistics notes later. It translated as something like, "You are beginning." I thought about that phrase for the rest of the day. You are beginning, not, you have arrived, not, you have succeeded. Beginning. As in, this is the start of something, and there is much further to go, and the further is what matters. In the afternoon I met with Peter in the corridor outside the human delegation office, a small room near the outer ring, with the same slightly wrong decor as my quarters, and we went over the implications together. He had been running analysis all morning, pulling data on every existing treaty and pending proposal that might be affected by the committee's findings. "The index reference is the big one," he said. He had a way of talking when he was excited about something, faster, with his hands, and right now his hands were moving constantly. If the committee is flagging it as a potential mechanism for de facto inequality, that opens the entire process to review, not just for us, for the Mirren, for the Sathine. You know they've been in observer status for 16 years. 16. They solved their internal governance crisis 6 years ago, and they still haven't been admitted. And the Goran Collective, one thing at a time, I said, though I was thinking the same things he was. The Meridian finding is the immediate issue. That's what we follow through on. Right. But Dara, I know, I said. I know. Because I understood what the committee's language meant in its careful formal way. I understood what the Lethani had done by adding it. I understood that something had shifted, not just for humanity's corridors, but for something larger. Something that had been building for a long time under the smooth surface of council proceedings, but I also understood that these things moved carefully. They moved in the language of legal findings and formal responses and deliberate procedures, and they moved at the pace of institutions that had existed for 800 years and intended to exist for 800. More, I had learned that pace. I had spent 11 years learning it, and I had also learned in the last 3 days that the pace could sometimes be moved. We file our formal response to the findings this week, I said. Comprehensive. Every point confirmed. Every citation reinforced, and we add the 4 additional references I have that the committee didn't pull. We file it cleanly on time, through proper channels. Peter, properly this time? It was proper last time, I said. It was just also effective. He laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind you only hear from someone when something has released that they had been holding for a long time. The formal response took 4 days to write. I worked on it myself, with Peter's research support and input from 2 legal consultants at the Earth Diplomatic Office. It was 61 pages long. It confirmed every finding, added the 4 additional citations, and included a section that I wrote myself, late on the 3rd night of drafting, that addressed the species maturity index question directly. Not aggressively, not with any particular heat, but clearly, in the careful language of legal analysis, laying out the 30-year record and what that record showed when examined against the Compact's stated principles. It was the most carefully written thing I had ever produced. I read it 5 times before signing it. I changed 12 words across those 5 readings. Then I submitted it through proper channels within the designated response window, with every citation numbered and formatted correctly. Ambassador Odom sent me a message the morning after submission. It said, I received the response document. I waited it. It is thorough. I waited, it said. Do not do anything else until I call you, I replied. Of course, she called an hour later. We spoke for 40 minutes. It was not, as I had expected, a difficult conversation. It was a serious one. She was precise, and she asked hard questions, and she did not offer any easy reassurances. But she also did not tell me I had been wrong. She asked what my analysis was of the Council's next steps. She asked what I anticipated from the Veth response. She asked whether the Lithani contact had continued, and I told her about the messages. And she was quiet for a moment and then said, That's significant. I know, I said. They don't usually move that quickly, she said. On anything. I know. Another pause. You read the entire 1100-year-old Lithani commentary, she asked. Twice, I said. The sound she made then was hard to describe. It was not quite a laugh. It was something more complicated than that. Something like the feeling of a long exhale after a very long time of not exhaling. Carry on, Dara, she said, and she ended the call. I sat in my quarters with the not quite to coffee that I had learned by now to make slightly better with the sweet packets, and I looked at the stars outside my window. In 6 days, the full council session would reconvene, the formal responses would be presented. The Veth hegemony would have filed their own response to the findings, and it would be careful and well-written, and would probably use the word partnership 14 times and find a way to express deep respect for the committee's work, while also expressing deep concern about the timeline and the precedents and the broader implications. And I would be in my seat, my one seat in the section that was slightly the wrong color. I would be there, with my tablet, and my notes, and my remaining 12 citations, and whatever new ones I had found in the last 4 days of reading, of which there were 7. I opened my tablet. I started a new notes page. At the top I wrote, Session 4 Preparation. Then I started from the beginning. The full council session reconvened on a morning when the station's orbital position brought the local star directly into alignment with the dome's filtering lens, which turned the pale gray light of the chamber into something almost warm. I noticed it when I walked in. It did not happen often, apparently. The Keth attendant, who had eventually become comfortable escorting me, mentioned. It was the first alignment in 4 months. I took my seat at 8:50, 10 minutes before the start. Councillor Thrix was already there. His delegation was full today. 5 Veth officials at the table. Compared to the 3 who had been there on the first day, they all had tablets. They were all reading. I noted this without changing anything about my expression. The chamber filled. All 12 sections at full representation. This session had drawn the senior delegates from every species, which told me that the preliminary findings had been taken seriously in ways that extended beyond the procedural. When an 800-year-old institution suddenly has standing room attendance, something has mattered. Elder Voss called the session to order. He acknowledged the Legal Standards Committee's preliminary findings. He noted that responses had been received from 11 of the 12 member delegations, and that the human delegation's response had been received within the window and was now in the record. He then noted, and his voice had something in it I had not heard before, a particular quality of attention, or care, that the committee's reference to the Species Maturity Index had been taken under advisement by the presiding council, and that a separate formal review of the index and its application had been commissioned. The chamber was very still. Councillor Thrix did not move, but one of his 5 officials made a very small motion, the Veth equivalent of a flinch, which was subtle but visible to someone who had spent the last week reading Veth body language materials. I wrote in my notes, the index review is confirmed. Then I looked up at the dome, at the warm light that only came every 4 months, and I breathed. This was not the end of anything. I understood that. The index review would take months, possibly longer, The meridian revisions would take months. Nothing in this chamber moved quickly. 800 years of institution had built a pace that was its own kind of force, slow and large and enormously resistant to urgency. But something had started, something that had been in the documents, in the text, in the legal foundations of the compact for 800 years, had been named. Precisely, in proper language, through proper channels, on the record, and it could not be unnamed. The session moved forward. The VETH formal response was presented. It was, as I had anticipated, careful and well constructed, and it used the word partnership 11 times, which was the same as day one, which probably meant something about where they had come out after the internal discussions. The Keth delegate presented a supporting brief for the findings. The Mirren, for the first time in 32 years, presented a formal position, statement, not an observation, not a note for the record, a formal position citing two of the same documents I had cited. I watched the Mirren delegate speak. He was younger than I had expected. Not young by human standards. Their species lived longer. But there was something in the way he held himself at the podium that I recognized. A particular kind of controlled energy. The kind you have when you have been waiting for a long time to say something true, and the door has finally opened. When he finished, he looked across the chamber. Briefly, quickly, in my direction. I did not change my expression, but I held his gaze for a moment, and then I nodded, very slightly, because it was a thing that meant the same thing in his language and mine. The session adjourned at 4. I walked back to my quarters through the outer corridor, which today had the same warm light filtering through the observation panels, the local star still in its rare alignment. I stopped at one of the panels and looked out. My tablet was full, notes from every day of the session, citations, cross-references, the messages from the Lethani, Peter's analysis reports, my own drafts and redrafts, and carefully maintained records of everything that had been said. 11 years of training and discipline and professional patience, and the last week of something that had felt, underneath all of that, like something older, like the particular human quality of refusing, at a certain point, to pretend you don't know what you know. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. "How was today?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Genuinely good." She asked about the corridors. I told her they were still secured, still under review, still ours. She asked about the session. I told her about the Mirren delegate. She did not know the Mirren, but she listened, and when I described the moment he cited the same documents, she made a sound that was quiet and warm. "Did you make friends?" she asked, which was what she had asked me every year of school when I came home. "I think so," I said, slowly. "Good. Friends are how you hold things." I did not know quite how to respond to that, so I just said yes, which was true. After the call, I changed the light in my room from warm to the setting I had found by accident on day 3, which turned out to be cooler than warm, but warmer than the original blue, and which had no name in the system but which I had labeled. In my room settings is right. Then I sat down and opened a new document on my tablet. At the top I wrote Session 5 Preparation. I had 19 new citations. I had the 7 from the last 4 days, plus 12 more that had come out of reading the committee's 43 pages very carefully, following their footnotes and then following the footnotes of the footnotes. I also had a message from the Lethani address, which had arrived while I was in the session, and which I had not yet read. I opened it now. It said, "The index review is the work of the next year. Perhaps longer. It is careful work. Are you patient?" I read that 3 times, then I typed back, "I am a human diplomat. I have been patient my entire career." The reply came in 3 minutes. It said, "Yes, but are you patient now that you know it works?" I looked at that question for a long time. It was the right question. It was the question that sat at the center of everything that had happened in the last week. Whether the knowledge that patience combined with precision and legal foundation and a refusal to pretend ignorance could actually move something, whether that knowledge would make me reckless or make me more careful. I thought about it honestly. Then I typed, "I think I am more patient now because now I know what I am being patient for." The reply came quickly. It said, "Good, then we have work to do." I set down the tablet. I looked at the window, at the stars, at the other ships docked along the outer ring. The Veth diplomatic cruiser was still there, still in its deep, certain blue. But there was another ship docked now, 3 berths down from it, that had not been there when I arrived. It was smaller, painted in a color I did not immediately recognize, a pale green, the color of something new. I checked the registry on my tablet. It was a Mirren diplomatic vessel. They had upgraded their delegation transport. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to Session 5 preparation and started from the beginning. 6 months later, the Council's Species Maturity Index Evaluation Board published a revised methodology report. I read it in my office back on Earth. I had come home for a 3-week review period before returning to the station at 7 in the morning with actual coffee, the kind my mother made. in a kitchen that looked out onto a coastline that was nothing like the city where she had grown up, rebuilt and different and still standing. The report ran to 97 pages. I read all of them. The revised methodology addressed 17 specific points of concern about how the index had been applied over the previous 30 years. It introduced 3 new oversight mechanisms. It established an independent panel to review any species score more than 2 evaluation cycles running to prevent the kind of permanent almost but not quite status that had defined humanity's experience for 2 decades. On page 63, in a table of index scores updated to reflect the new methodology, I found the entry for humanity. The score had moved not by 0.3 points, not by 1 point, by 4.7 points, which was what happened when the adjustments were applied correctly to the data that had always been there. 4.7 points. In one methodology revision, with no new data, because the data had always been there, it had always said exactly what it said. Someone had just, finally, read the methodology with the same care that the methodology required. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I put down my coffee and went to find my mother, who was in the garden because she was always in the garden in the morning, and I stood at the garden door and she looked up and she read something in my face the way she always had. "Good news?" she asked. "Complicated news," I said. "Mostly good," she nodded. "Tell me." I told her about the 4.7 points. I told her about the new oversight mechanisms. I told her about the Mirren delegation, which had formally filed for full membership last month and was progressing through the process with what one council observer called unusual speed. I told her about the Sathine, who had submitted their membership application for the first time in 8 years. I told her about the Lithani message I had received last week, which had said, "The work continues. It will be here when you return." My mother listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she had always listened, the way I had always known I could count on her to listen. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. 4.7 points, she said. "Yes." Just from reading it correctly, yes. She looked at the garden. She had been rebuilding this garden for 11 years the way she had rebuilt coastlines for 30. Slowly, with careful attention to what was already there, and what needed to grow, and what needed to be held in place until it was strong enough to hold itself. "That's how it usually works," she said, which was exactly what she would say, and exactly what I needed to hear. I went back to the station 2 weeks later. New session, full chamber. My seat was still slightly the wrong color. I had stopped trying to change it, because it was, I had decided, a useful reminder of something I did not want to forget. Elder Voss opened the session. The agenda was long. There were 3 pending membership applications, the continued Meridian negotiations, 2 new interspecies agreements in early stages, and a proposal from the Lithani that the Species Maturity Index evaluation results for all current and pending member species be published in the Open Council record with full methodology documentation available to every delegation. I read that agenda item in my seat before the session opened, and I held very still for a moment. Then I opened a new notes page. At the top I wrote today's items. Councillor Thrix was at his table. 3 officials today, down from 5. He looked, if not different exactly, then at a slightly different angle. The angle of someone who has revised a position and not yet fully settled into the revision. I had come to recognize that angle. It was a useful one to see. When Elder Voss called the session to order, he paused before announcing the first agenda item and looked out at the chamber. All 12 sections. The 13th section, 1 seat, slightly wrong color. "Before we begin," Elder Voss said in his slow and formal cadence, "the council notes the addition of 3 new membership applications to the active docket. The process for each will follow the standard review under the compact. Standard review, not observer status, not a period of guided development. Standard review under Article 14, under the Solon Accords, under the full document, read correctly." The Mirren delegate was in his seat. He was reading his tablet. I could see from across the chamber that he was very calm. The particular calm of someone who has been waiting a long time and can now afford to wait a little longer, because the waiting is finally going somewhere. Elder Voss began the session. I opened my notes. I had 22 citations ready for today. Not because I expected to use them. The agenda was structured. The day was procedural. The immediate urgency of the Meridian situation had settled into the slower work of revision and formal process. But I had them because that was who I was now, or who I had always been and had finally decided to be all the way. Councillor Thrix, at a moment when the chamber's attention was elsewhere, a vote proceeding in another section, glanced across at my table. I happened to be looking in his direction. We held eye contact for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he looked back at his own tablet. I looked back at mine. And then, because it was a long session and there was much to get through, and the Lithani proposal about the open index record was coming up in the afternoon and I wanted to be fully prepared for the discussion, I turned to my notes, and I started reading. There is a note in my jacket pocket. It has been there for 6 months. The paper is worn at the fold from being handled, but the words are still clear. Do not do the thing. I keep it because it is accurate, not as a warning. I understood what Ambassador Odom meant when she wrote it, and I understood, in the way that you understand things after you have moved through them and come out the other side, that she had been right to write it, but accurate in another way too. A way she had not intended, and maybe I had not entirely intended either, when I turned to the wrong page in that first session. The thing that humans do, the thing that 11 years of diplomatic training had asked me to keep in the room at the back of my mind, was not anger, was not aggression, was not the dramatic, loud, force of nature version of ourselves that other species had built their concerns around. The reason for the Species Maturity Index, and the guided development frameworks, and the 40 years of observer status, and the polite, careful management of when and how much humanity was allowed to participate. The thing, it turned out, was this: reading the document, all of it, the whole thing, and then saying, in a room full of very old institutions and very experienced beings, in a level voice with proper citations, exactly what it said. That was the thing, and the thing worked. I keep the note because I want to remember what it felt like to stand at that podium. On day 2 of my first council session, 3 sentences prepared, 37 citations in hand, knowing that one path was safe and familiar and the other was not, and knowing, with a particular certainty that comes from a night spent reading every word, and a career spent learning when the words mattered, exactly which path was the right one. I keep it because next year there will be new delegates, young ones, maybe new postings, first sessions, their own versions of Ambassador Odom, telling them the same thing in different words. And I want to tell them when the time comes. The note is right. Do not do the thing carelessly. Do not do it recklessly, or angrily, or for the wrong reasons, but know what the thing is, know it precisely, and know that the document is there. It has always been there. 800 years of foundational law, sitting in the council record, waiting for someone to read all of it and say, here is what it says, here is what it means. The day humanity's polite mode failed was not the end of something. It was the first sentence of a much longer document, and I have always been very good at reading.